I think this is actually, in terms of Ukraine's long-term future, a very consequential move, and we'll come back to Ukraine's response shortly. But anyway, it's important to say that though Putin's speech, which is the main event of this ceremony, the signing ceremony in the Kremlin, was of course focused on the inclusion of these four regions in the Russian Federation, it was not the main part of his speech. And his speech overall was actually quite extraordinary, and in some ways marked a significant departure from speeches that Putin has made in the past. The first point to make is that Putin, over the course of his speech, for the first time that I'm aware of, clearly differentiated Russia from Europe. Now, this is an important point to make because up to this point, Putin and other Russian leaders have insisted that Russia is an integral part of Europe. But what Putin did was this. He said that the Western powers, he specifically and principally talked about the English-speaking powers, the United States, Britain, he mentioned France too, have a imperialist, colonialist mentality. And that they have sought at various points in history since the late Middle Ages to expand their power across the world in order to achieve global dominance, but also in order to enrich themselves at the expense of those countries, those nations, those civilizations which they had subjugated. And very strikingly, Putin said that this was the fate earmarked for Russia itself. Russia avoided becoming a colony of the European powers because of its success in the 16th and 17th centuries in creating its own centralized and powerful state. And that meant that Russia was able to withstand this Western colonial aggression. And he said that this continued right up until the 1980s, when, as a result of processes which we all know, the Soviet Union collapsed, and for a certain period of time in the 1990s, Russia did become a colony of the Western powers, by this time, of course, led by the United States. And Putin said that all the same processes that played out in the other colonies that the Europeans and the West managed to capture. He talked about India, China. China never quite became a colony, but was a kind of semi-colony at one point. Africa, all of these places, he spoke about how they were looted of their resources by the Western powers, and he said that the same thing was happening to Russia in the 1990s. Now, you may or may not agree with this history, but the point is that what Putin is doing here, and it is very, very interesting, is that he is telling Russians and he is telling the global South, don't think of Russia as a European power. We were never part of this globalist, global, colonialist, imperialist project. On the contrary, like you, we were one of its targets. We managed to a great extent and very successfully to defend ourselves for a long time. We briefly succumbed in the 1990s, but we are resisting again. So what that does is it tells countries like China, India, the African states, the nations of the Middle East, other Asian states, the states of Latin America, we are more like you than we are like the United States and the rest of the West. We are victims of the same type of colonial aggression that you have been. We identify with you, so you can identify with us. And he made a very interesting comment. He spoke of Russia as a civilizational state, implying that Russia has its own distinctive civilization, which by definition must be different from that of Europe and the United States and the rest of the West. And of course he went into considerable detail, and here the West has given him an enormous amount of help. He went into considerable detail about how the West is now busy trying to cancel Russian culture, proving thereby that its Russian culture, civilization is distinct from that of the West. And he also, of course, went out of his way to talk about the social distinctions, the famous lifestyle issues. I have to be very careful what I say here, which make Russia different from the West, but make it much more like the global South. Now that is a very interesting point, because no Russian leader, certainly not since the time of Peter the Great, has talked in that way. No Russian leader up to this point has come out and said that Russia is distinct and different from the West in the way and to the extent that Putin has done. And that in itself is remarkable, especially given Putin's authority in Russia and the long stretch of time that he has been leader. But it's also, I suspect, a view which quite a lot of Russians now, perhaps even a critical mass of Russians, will share. Now, how long it will persist for the long term, that's another matter. Whether ultimately the Russians will say to themselves, well, hold on, despite all our problems with Europe, we are ultimately much more European than we are anything else. And whether they'll be drawn back to Europe one day again, I don't know. But for the moment, Russia has a leader who is repudiating, who is rejecting the West. It's important to stress that throughout the communist era, no Soviet leader ever spoke in this way. Lenin, who was the first leader of the Soviet Union, he conceived of the USSR, Russia, as a force that would spread the workers' revolution throughout the West, and which was the vanguard of the proletariat, the working class, including and perhaps even especially in Europe. Joseph Stalin not only thought in similar ways, but during the Second World War, if you read his wartime speeches, he clearly spoke about the Soviet Union's mission to liberate the rest of Europe from the German plague. Of course, he spoke a lot about the ideology of that period, which I don't want to refer to, again, for various reasons. But if you read his speeches at that time, he clearly still conceived of the Soviet Union as belonging to a cultural world that included the West. And of course, subsequent Soviet leaders, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, all the rest, well, obviously, they saw the Soviet Union as having a distinct identity and personality, but they too never thought of the Soviet Union in the kind of distinct, non-Western, civilizational terms that Putin is now talking about. And I think this is something which has momentous implications. It means that, in effect, and for the time being, the West has lost Russia. So that has big implications because, of course, Russia, as Putin was at pains to say, is a country with tremendous resources. And the fact that the West is not able to rely on those resources is going to weaken the West in the long term as it pitches itself in competition with the other rising powers. And here I would add that Putin made some really very interesting points, and his economic history here is not wholly wrong, by the way. He points out that in the 1980s, even as the Soviet Union was breaking down, the West was actually in the grip of a very real economic crisis. And he's right, actually. There were moments when things got better and got worse. There was a period of brief revival in the mid-1980s as a result of certain supply-side reforms which were carried out by Ronald Reagan's administration in the United States. There's a big open question mark over how sustainable that recovery was. But Putin said that in his speech that the only way that the Western powers were able to resolve the problems, the economic problems that had struck them at the end of the 70s and in the 1980s was during the 1990s by gaining control and extract